I'm Michael Kelleher, Director of the Windham-Campbell Prizes at Yale University. Welcome to the 2021 Windham-Campbell Prizes Virtual Festival. We'll be streaming a new episode each week for the next 9 Wednesdays. Each episode will focus on one of this year's prize recipients, and the final episode will be a keynote address by U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. While the episodes stream, you'll be able to chat with other audience members, and following the live stream, we invite you to join the writer in a live Zoom Q&A. In the week between each episode, there will be plenty of on-demand content available for you to enjoy. Today's episode features poet, essayist, and fiction writer Dionne Brand, who will lead us on a tour of her adopted city of Toronto, including several public art installations devoted to her work.
This city is beauty, unbreakable and amorous as eyelids. In the streets, pressed with fierce departures, submerged landings, I am innocent as thresholds and smashed nightbirds, lovesick as empty elevators. I think that most of my writing, most of the novels, are full of the city of Toronto, full of the city, anonymous and specific, about the ways in which the city encapsulates life, captures life, makes life happen. This city is a really interesting place because it is supposedly the city with the most varied communities on the planet, right? Save for the Haudenosaunee, the Mississauga, who inhabited this city, thousands of years ago, this space, thousands of years ago, and this space was called Takaranto at the time. Short of them, everyone else migrated to this city. The English, the Scottish, the Welsh, the French, and later migrations, migration through slavery, migration through all kinds of labor. And so that's why it's a fascinating city to me, because it is a city of constant churning and constant overturning. But it's a city that also constantly wants to set itself as if that didn't happen. So I sometimes refer to it as the city that's happened and never happened before. And actually my poem that is in the alleyway on Dundas Street near the Arts Etobicoke is about the fullness of migration that this city is constructed around. And it's a poem to Article 13 of the International Human Rights Declaration, which is the article about the freedom of movement, right? So I'm fascinated by the interactions of all the migratory beings in the city. And that meeting is sometimes violent, and that meeting is sometimes wondrous. And so I want to write in those works about the multiplicity of those meetings. So thresholds and doorways occur in the work all the time, I think. I think it's one of those things, that happen in my work a lot. When I think of my novels, I think the first novel, In Another Place Not Here, in it, the city is interior. So there are no exteriors in that novel that look out into the city, but it's the interior life of the people in the novel. And both of them are fleeing some harm, one fleeing a country that she has come from to look for the woman who made that country bearable for her. They are lovers, but they are separate. They have their own difficulties with life and their own past, in a way. One is searching for a revolution. The other finds that revolution in that woman. They meet briefly somewhere else, but this city is the city that they both inhabit at various points in time. So that was in another place, not here. And as I say in that novel, the city is mostly interior, the interior life. Let me declare doorways, corners, pursuit, let me say, standing here in eyelashes, in invisible breasts, in the shrinking lake, in the tiny shops of untrue recollections, the brittle, gnawed life we live, I am held and held. The shrinking lake in the poem refers to the toxicity of the lake. Every day, particularly in the summer, you have to find out which part of that lake you can walk into. Because of all the effluent into the lake, because of the various industry that put out poisons into our lakes, or the various landfills that take up more and more of the lake. But periodically the lake comes back, you know. So the lake begins to shrink as a site of plenty, as a site of bounty of like fish and fauna and so on, right? And people in the city begin to think of the lake as merely something they think is sort of recreational, but not as a being that keeps living and keeps responding to the ways in which we live. Then to tiny shops of untrue recollections, the nostalgias that people hold on to in cities, the nostalgias they think they've let go, but they sometimes enact in ways that have to do with power over other people. Yeah? The nostalgias they even build as histories, and the ways in which that nostalgia, let's say English nostalgia for empire, becomes codified and petrified. Or the small nostalgias of patriarchy, when people were in control of other people. But a city breaks those nostalgias in some ways, but they are also reconstituted. Living in this city is both the robustness but the fragility of people who live in the city. And certainly the robustness and the fragility of the characters in the novels that I write. And so in my third novel, What We All Long For, the city is full of that fragility, right? All of the protagonists in What We All Long For are children of people who have immigrated to this country. But these children are born here and try to find a way in the city. And it is difficult for them because they carry the histories of those parents, and they become the translators of the city for their parents. And so they have an enormous, enormous load, weight to bear in the city. And so What We All Long For is full of their trying to make their way through the city. And What We All Long For now in that novel, the city is present as a physical being, as both space and consciousness. And it is the consciousness of these four young people that begin to construct the city. So there's one young woman in the novel who bicycles through the city, right? She's always seen on a bike moving through the city, moving down the main artery of the city, moving across Bloor Street in the city. She has her own longings, her own fragilities, which cannot let anyone else in some ways. But they are all of them struggling to be in communion, to be in life together in some kind of way. The touch of everything blushes me. Pigeons and wrecked boys, half-dead hours, blind musicians, inconclusive women in bruised dresses. Even the habitual gray-suited men with terrible briefcases. How come? How come I anticipate nothing as intimate as history? I think when I wrote this poem, it was at a particular point. I think as a poet, I am open, maybe sometimes too open to emotion around me or what people are living around me. I think sometimes I see too much or take in too much. And so even later in this book of poems, I talk about a siren, the sound that a siren makes, and how it's somebody's life falling apart. And I'm open to what happens to people. I'm open to their danger. I'm open to their violence. I'm open to their want, open to their desires. I find myself sometimes, unable not to see or something. It's just difficult not to feel the world at very close quarters, not to feel the world right on the level of skin. Not to see want in the city, sometimes these days, I walk along Bloor Street, and particularly during the pandemic, you see so much harm and so much hurt, right? And I'm attuned to that, and I think I should be attuned to it, and I think we should all be attuned to it. My fourth novel, Love Enough, is a novel about multiple characters really trying to find their way around in the city. There is a man who is a taxi driver. His name is Daoud, and he has a son called Bedri, who he has completely lost control of. My friend who has lent me his studio here, Abdi Osman, the artist, was a great source of information about my character, Bedri, about the loosening of holds on children that parents who emigrate here have, and what that means for them. That is a loosening of holds on traditions, on ways of being in the world, even on affinities in a way. And I remember having the conversation with Abdi, and he said, there are 5 airports that are involved when parents try to send their children back to their home in order to reacclimatize them to those ways of being, those fealty, to affinities, to something that they knew, which their children have absolutely no respect for at some point. And those 5 airports are actually in that work, Love Enough. And Daoud, the taxi driver, talks about those 5 airports. And he drives along the south of the city, and he observes the life in the city. And he's privy to all the life in the city from the rear view mirror, his own rear view mirror, which looks at the passengers in his taxi. So he sees all kinds of life, right? Making itself and unmaking itself, doing itself and undoing itself. His son, Bedri, is in trouble in the novel. And he has a friend, and he and the friend drive along the top of the city. So the novel draws a map of the city, at least a driving map of the city. From the top of the city, the Highway 401, to the bottom of the city, the Lakeshore Boulevard and the Gardner Expressway. And so I notice in this novel how present the city is, and how the city's pull and tug and movement change the characters in the city, and the characters make a different life in the city. We live in these cities now, and they are becoming hotter and colder and more implicated in questions of climate change, questions of how we are to live. We are now living with a virus which challenges the very construct of how we thought about cities, or what we thought about how life moves. In a sense, the commodification of life in the ways that we live it now. That is all in that novel, Love Enough. And whether there can be I suppose, love enough for us to, undo some of that. Yeah. Would I have had a different life, failing this embrace with broken things, iridescent veins, ecstatic bullets, small cracks in the brain? Would I know these particular facts? How a phrase scars a cheek, how water dries love out, this a thought as casual as any second, eviscerates her breath. In what we all long for, something dreadful happens at the end, or at least we think that there is something dreadful and violent that happens at the end of the novel, but we are not sure. And in a sense, the fourth novel, Love Enough, begins at the end of that third novel, where those two boys who may have committed something, who may have been involved in that, begin that novel. The city, of course, is full of violences of all kinds, institutional violences, state violences, and those I have written into the novels. Another part of the city is one lives in the city anonymously, but commonly. So that's the strange paradox of cities, right? The strange contradiction of them is that we all think that we are kind of individuals in cities when we are incredibly common. We wear the same jeans, we wear the same t-shirts, so there's this incredible big commonality, yet the city and urban living presents us with the possibility of living anonymously. And these things that I think through in those novels about the city, I'm fascinated with them. The other thing that happens in the city, for example, the novel Love Enough begins with someone, looking in the rear view mirror at a sunset on DuPont Street, right? Seeing a beautiful sunset over what is really a quite ugly street, an industrialized street, a street where there used to be a lot of foundries and factories, etc., and now is not a main artery, but has now become a kind of main artery. And the only beauty you can see on this street is if you are going east on an afternoon and you look in the rearview mirror, you will see what remains of the sun, what remains of the planet. In a way, you cannot see the planet fully in a city, because the city is so full of light, so full of the sort of detritus of our industrial living, that you cannot actually see the planet. And some of these things I try to bring into the work, some of these questions and conundrums. And this, we meet in careless intervals, in coffee bars, gas stations, in prosthetic conversations, lotteries, untranslatable mouths, in versions of what we may be. A tremor of the hand in the realization of endings, a glancing blow of tears on skin, the keen dismissal in speed. And so the final novel, Theory, is about those careless intervals, I suppose, those coffee bars and gas stations, those prosthetic conversations. And after moving out into the city and showing its geographies in the last two novels before Theory, Theory now works again in the interior space of the mind of the narrator, though it does have some views of the city too, like the place that the last lover lives, or the place that the second lover lives. In a sense, the first lover, whose name is Selah, the narrator remarks that she has not written of any exteriors. She cannot remember what the door outside where she lived with that lover looked like. But with the second lover, they live along the railway tracks in the junction, the area called the Junction in the city. And the third lover lives above a garage. And so the city moves in and out of the novels, but I think those novels in particular signify the city as a character. It's interesting that this poem, Thirsty, kind of, suddenly as I'm thinking about it now, it's the construct in some ways of those novels, right? In brief and tight forms.
We're going to end today's episode with a short reading. But before we do, I'd like to invite you to a live Zoom conversation immediately following the episode.
So I'm going to read from Theory, and I'm reading from the third chapter in Theory called Odalise. And Odalise is the third lover of the narrator, whose name is Theoria. And the novel in general is about someone who is doing her dissertation, but is always distracted by her various lovers. But she has a great theory of the world that she must write down, but there are always these interventions. So, from the chapter Odalise. As with all things I'm attracted to, Odalise frightened me. I think that it's love I feel, but it's fear. I'm anxious about my dissertation as usual. It feels as if it'll never be complete. I plunge into one idea and it sets off other ideas and I abandon the first idea. And all this happens before I can write the past idea down. But primarily, I'm working with Gramsci's definition of common sense, which he variously defined as the public and manifest form of the national culture, a given social structure's popular science, the traditional popular conception of the world, which is unimaginatively called instinct, although it too is in fact a primitive and elementary historical acquisition. I'm interested in a complete overhaul of the way we live. Sometimes I sit at a cafe and watch a street go by and I'm struck by the smallness of the social world. Others have drawn this conclusion before, but still, we're like a colony of ants chewing away at a patch of earth, unaware of the whole universe around us. Sitting there, I feel strangely apart. The data from the exosphere, the Milky Way, the signals from another hemisphere flood in, giving me an awareness that doesn't illuminate me so much as make me resentful of the people passing by, clutching their bags of groceries, fighting their petty wars, occupying the slender earth without seeing. It strikes me, therefore, how inconsequential the quotidian is. I might say under different influences that the quotidian is in fact the important thing, the beautiful thing. But that's for another day. On the days when I observe the dreadful gluttony and smallness of this present reality, I can't ignore the cravenness. I just can't. On those days, I observe the persistent futility of these daily activities. When I say I feel apart, it's not that I feel superior, as if I know something others don't. It's that I feel truly apart, as if I'm an animal looking at another species. Again, what do I know of other animals to speak this way? I mean, I feel the singularity of consciousness and not of the body. The body is an inefficient encumbrance or liability or a thing whose liability is obvious. It is fussy and fragile and unaware of itself as useless and futile. When I said all this to Odalise, she accused me of pessimism or snobbishness. She referred me to some higher power she is pursuing at the moment. I was not the best person in the world. Forgive me for that admission. It seems honest enough to say it, but that honesty is in the end weaning sympathy. This is how a sentence begins sometimes. I was not the best person in the world. And then the speaker goes on to malign the person who was unable to forgive them their failings. At any rate, thinking back, I recognize that in regard to Odalise, I wasn't the best person in the world, and I expected her to forgive this flaw in me wholesale. Odalise was her real name. She had been through several names, she told me, as she found her way across this city. She was Marta for a cleaning job in the financial district, Angela for a front desk at a lawyer's office, and Ségolène for an interior design company. When I met her, she was Ségolène, but she told me her true name was Odalise, and she had begun life in a small town outside of Cartagena. This is what first endeared me to Odalise, this changeability and self-creation. I immediately thought of Garcia Marquez's Aracataca. I sometimes think that for an academic, I'm far too seducible by fictions, and that is how I get involved with the wrong person. In the town where Odalise was born, and I forget the name of the town, there was one bus in and out every second Thursday of the month. Odalise said she loved that bus as a child and couldn't wait to get on it when she grew up, never to return, yes, to San Basilio. When she said this to me, Odalise had such a look on her face that my usual curiosity dried on my tongue. It was a subject I decided that I would let Odalise return to in her own time. Whenever she did, I was silent. This way, I learned that in San Basilio, each afternoon at 2 p.m., Odalise heard the nasal chime of the lottery seller saying, "This is your lucky hour, this is your lucky hour, es tu hora de suerte, es tu hora de suerte." These two events, the bus every other Thursday and the call of the lottery seller at 2 p.m., Odalise said, wrenched her out of her childhood. This was Odalise's power over me, the power to silence me. What could I say in the face of her childhood? Mine had been uneventful by comparison. She said the call of the lottery seller was desultory and hopeless in the hot afternoons of those years. He himself seemed without luck. His clothing was disheveled, his shoes laceless. And after he sold what little he could in San Basilio, he disappeared in the late afternoon, dust seeming to envelop him at the perimeter of Odalise's depth of vision. If he were offering something that he himself enjoyed, Odalise said, she might have forgiven him. If he'd come wearing fine suits and rings, he could have been excused. Even if his disposition were hopeful inside his dishevelment, he would have made a better case. That he came morose and ill-clad and made no effort at joy, dismissed his entire proposal, causing Odalise's rancor toward him. There was no need to sell poor people more disappointment and grief. Even as a child, without the words to say so, Odalise cursed him and consigned him to hell. Yet the people of San Basilio would buy his tickets and live in impossibility until the weekly draw brought them back again to their present lives. Thank you.